ended, I hope.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for that very interesting question to the Speaker. I want to start again by informing the House that this is an extremely important debate as it relates to Canadian values and the direction that governments move to reflect those values of Canadians, Mr. Speaker. And so I give you these early statistics of why, in fact, the present system has failed us miserably, which is to keep the use of cannabis illegal in this country for decades and decades and decades, even though, Mr. Speaker, it's true to say that most Canadians aren't respecting or following that law. And I want to, as well, remind the House and Canadians that Statistics Canada has indicated that over 699,000 Canadians have a criminal record as a result of convictions on charges of cannabis possession. Mr. Speaker, when you look at the statistics, you look at the convictions, you look at the continued use, it shows very clearly that Canada has failed in the relationship with its constituents as it relates to the use of cannabis in Canada. So why are we legalizing cannabis? Very clearly, the approach that we've been using here has not worked for Canadians. It's not going to work for Canadians, and it's a drug that's easily accessible to young people all across this nation. Mr. Speaker, I've had the great privilege of living in Northern Ontario, living in British Columbia, in the Okanagan Valley, and living in Alberta, in Calgary, over the last 10 years. And in those 10 years, I've had the opportunity, because my children were in school, high school, elementary, and now they're in university, and I've had an opportunity to speak to them and some of their friends about just what's going on as it relates to this particular subject matter. And it's clear and it's true when people say it's easier to get cannabis out on the street than it is to buy a bottle of beer on the street. And it's true in BC, it's true in Northern Ontario, it's true in Alberta and in Calgary where I lived. It's true down the street here, you could walk down the street in Ottawa and you would find the same situation. So we can do as the Conservatives are doing here in the House and pretend that nothing is wrong, or we can work very hard to change the approach that we need to change. And so the work of this House is to put in place a very robust regulatory structure that controls the use of cannabis. Here's the public expectations, Mr. Speaker. The public expectations are that we will put in legislation that protects our children and youth. That doesn't seem like the area that we've spent a lot of time positioning ourselves as a society, because if it's true what I hear from the youth, that you can just go into the playground of high schools and someone's there already selling you cannabis if you want to buy it, that we have not done a very good job of protecting the interests of our young people. So, Mr. Speaker, I think the whole idea of restricting the access, banning products and packaging that may be appealing to children, we can keep cannabis out of the hands of our youth. Yes, of course, it's going to be a difficult job as it is with alcohol and tobacco, but society has a responsibility to do everything in its power to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that that is indeed the case. So what's government's expectations, Mr. Speaker? And that's the issue that a number of members have been focusing their attention on this morning and this afternoon, is that there's not just one government at play here. There are a number of governments, and what their expectations are obviously are different. The expectations of the federal government is to put in good legislation that meets the needs of our young people, meets the regulatory structure that will allow for us to commit resources that will make a difference. And then there's the expectation that the provincial government will put in place the kind of regulatory structure that will make it safe, and it will be explainable to Canadians, and in this case Ontarians where I live, as to how you would purchase, what the packaging will look like, what the cost will be, and in fact where you would go, Madam Speaker, to purchase legal cannabis. And then, of course, there is the need for the legislation to reflect the role of those governments, and I include in those, Madam Speaker, the First Nation governments, because I have the honour and distinction of representing the most First Nations in all of Ontario. And in those 42 First Nations, we know that there is an interest of those communities to do it, to have regulations and structures somewhat different that might be the case in non-Native communities, municipalities, and the such around the country. So our expectations, Madam Speaker, is that we will have tough laws around the sale, the purchase, and of course the activities of the criminal activities on the whole issue of cannabis. That, of course, will further protect youth, and so penalties for promoting cannabis use and the products to youth will hold very strict penalties, and I think that's the right way to approach this whole process. Madam Speaker, I was asked by a reporter in my own writing the other day, why are the penalties so severe, up to 14 years in jail, for selling to youth or using a youth to commit a cannabis-related offence? Well, it's simple. We want to signal to Canadians that we're serious about controlling and managing the sale of cannabis. It's not a simple matter of suggesting that society has evolved to the point where our expectations are youth will be using cannabis, Madam Speaker, but in fact our role and our expectations as governments is that we'll do a much better job than we've done in the past, because the numbers show the failure of society to protect our youth as it relates to cannabis and those things relating to the use of cannabis. So, Madam Speaker, I commend the government for its tough approach dealing with the sale of cannabis. And I commend the government for taking on a project that we all know has a lot of people who are for and against this. Madam Speaker, if you look at the numbers of states, countries, and other jurisdictions that are now moving where Canada is going today, it shows that they all agree that the work or the issue of cannabis is not going to go away, and indeed we're not reflecting the needs of our society. I just thought I'd show you a little document here of a study of some 18 states that have decriminalized. There are medical marijuana legalized states now. There are dozens, and now there are many states, Madam Speaker, who have basically fully legalized marijuana. This is to suggest that the path we're taking is the path that many others are, and I commend the government for doing that work here in the House today.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Madam Speaker, first I'd like to thank my friend and colleague